2020 was a huge year for mirrorless cameras. You know, with the cameras like the Sony A7S III came the ability to finally shoot higher bit rates, came the ability to finally shoot 10-bit recordings with 422. You know, with the Sony A7S III finally came the 4K slow-mo at 100 frames per second or 120 frames per second, depending on where you live. We finally got a Sony mirrorless camera that wouldn't overheat when shooting 4K for a long time. The Sony A7S III brought the more professional kind of features that cameras like the Sony A7SIII had, while also bringing features that the likes of A7 never had, all into a small mirrorless package that you can fit into your backpack that turns on very quickly. But that was 2020. Now we're in 2022. Now there's the Sony A7 Mark IV. And my name is Michael Smolski. I'm a sports documentary filmmaker primarily. I am also the co-founder of a football magazine and a production company called Football is Everywhere. And I've been using the Sony A7S III now for quite some time. Is it still worth it in 2022? At the end of the day, the best way to talk about photos is by showing photos. But the main thing you're going to be asking when it comes to this camera is the 12 megapixel sensor good enough for your needs? And I'm going to put it this way. Like I said, I run a magazine, Football is Everywhere. And most of the photos in that magazine were actually taken on the Sony A7S III on the 12 megapixel sensor. Some of them printed over 2 pages, and you look at the magazine, you wouldn't notice that this is 12 megapixels. You know, of course limitations apply. If you want to print something very big, like I'm talking billboards, obviously 12 megapixels isn't going to cut it. But if you're printing for a magazine, even A3 posters, if you're using photos on the internet, 12 megapixels absolutely does the job. And because there's less than megapixels for the size of the sensor, there's more light per pixel, meaning better low light performance. But you already know that from every single review you probably watched. I do take a lot of photos at football matches, and 12 megapixels isn't always great when it comes to that, because sometimes you need to crop, especially if you want to do portrait and you took it in landscape. Photoshop has this incredible hack if you edit in RAW. If you're in camera RAW, you know, you press the 3 dots, there's an ability to enhance the photo. It's a relatively new feature. It has been around for some time now, but it's still relatively new, not that used. That feature increases the resolution of the photo. It makes it sharper, and I'm gonna put it this way. It works incredibly well. It literally makes photos that don't really look that good, that you probably wouldn't put on the internet otherwise. It makes them usable. It genuinely makes them usable. So if you're worried about 12 megapixel not being good enough, you also have that enhanced feature. Most people looking at this camera are probably looking for a camera that shoots great photos, but that also, most importantly, also shoots incredible video. You know, in Sony A7 Mark III, it was a great camera as far as photos, but the video aspect of it, at the time it was great, and I still think the footage on the Sony A7 Mark III is great. You can get great footage, but it was very limited by overheating, by the lack of 10-bit. There was a lot of limitations to it, and the Sony A7S III fixed them, but now there's also the Sony A7 Mark IV, which also fixed them. It also has the 10-bit recording and that kind of stuff. So, and it is cheaper. So you might be wondering, hold on, is the Sony A7S III still worth it in 2022? Or now with the Sony A7 Mark IV out, maybe perhaps that's cheaper, maybe that's a better option for me, because it also has that extra megapixels for photos. And I'm gonna put it this way. It all depends on 2 major factors. Are you gonna be shooting slow motion a lot? And are you gonna be moving a lot with your camera? And let me explain those. Firstly, slow motion wise, Sony A7S III, it comes with 4K at 100 frames or 120 depending on your region. That has to do with flickering on lights. If you're in America, you can shoot 120. In Europe, you shoot around 100 because the flickering, flicker is not nice. I shoot a lot of sports content. It's very nice to kind of slow down certain aspects so you can see these kind of details that you normally wouldn't see if, you know, someone is kicking a ball or scoring a goal or celebrating. Sometimes the ability to showcase something in slow motion when it comes to sports It allows you to tell a better story. It allows you to show details that otherwise you just wouldn't catch with your eyes. And the Sony A7S III, it allows you to shoot in that 100 or 120 frames, versus the Sony A7 Mark IV, it only shoots 60 max or 50 depending where you are in 4K, and that's still nice, but it's not quite that nice. It's only half the speed, you can slow down, and that's not quite the same thing. The second thing that is important to talk about is whether you're gonna be moving with your camera. You know, if you're shooting on your tripod, if you're gonna be shooting mostly still content, then the Sony A7 Mark IV is great. But one of the issues that the Sony A7 Mark III had, that is also on the Sony A7 Mark IV, is the rolling shooter. If you're shooting a video and moving very fast, rolling shooter, it's essentially the image losing the shape. It's quite apparent that there is a huge rolling shooter issue, and that applies to the Sony A7 Mark III and the Sony A7 Mark IV. Meanwhile, the Sony A7S III does an incredible job at handling the rolling shooter. And for that, if you're gonna be shooting, you know, just moving your camera when filming a lot, then the A7S III just becomes the obvious choice as far as filmmaking is concerned. But if you're gonna be shooting a YouTube video like this, where I'm just on the tripod talking to you, you probably don't need the Sony A7S III for that. You also don't need the 120 frames for that, because 60 is well then good enough to capture a B-roll of the camera or something like that. But overall, as a camera alone, not compared to anything else, the fact that you can shoot 10-bit 422, the fact that you can shoot 4K without overheating. You know, the Sony A7 Mark III, sometimes it looked unprofessional because it just started overheating in the middle of an interview and I had to wait. Sometimes it ruins the moment, you know? So then that's the question, like, maybe you don't need the Sony A7S III, but maybe you do have an issue with overheating, and are you willing to risk losing that specific intense moment in an interview because your camera overheated? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Are you willing? Is it fine? Did you ever have this issue? Sony A7S III doesn't have that issue. I have the Sony A7, which is considered like the mecca of documentary filmmaking cameras. You know, everyone that makes documentaries pretty much has one, talks about it, had one before, you know. People love it. But the thing is, Sony A7S III is so much more superior in so many of the things than the FS7, while also being a much smaller package that's much simpler to use, that's much more efficient to use as a one-man crew. There is also the FX3, which is more of a rugged body kind of camera. It doesn't have the viewfinder. It's pretty much the same camera in a different body, and it's more expensive. But maybe it's, you know, people talk about the A7S III, but maybe depending on your needs, the FX3 might be a better camera for you. It comes included with this XLR adapter, and that is so important because that's a big difference between the Sony A7S III and the FX6 or FS7, FX9. You know, it's the ability to, it's how many audio channels you can have at the same time. The A7S III out of the box is limited to one, and while that's fine, works okay, if you want to have a microphone on your subject, but you also want to record audio while filming a documentary, you can't do that out of the box. You need to buy yourself a special adapter, which is much bulkier, and also it's quite expensive. Like, it's more expensive than buying the FX3 with which has the adapter included. Of course, A7S III without the adapter, much cheaper than the FX3, but if you want the adapter later on, it is going to be more expensive than just buying the FX3. And of course, you need to talk about the other things, and I think probably a lot of other reviews already talked about them, so I just kind of wanted to give some things that maybe some people didn't talk about. The screen, compared to the Sony A7 Mark III, it's so much better. You know, I actually see kind of what it looks like rather than this kind of not similar at all kind of footage that I see on the Sony A7 Mark III. The screen is rotating fully, which is great. Makes life easy. At the same time, the designers messed it up a little bit, because if you want to connect the headphone jack to listen, you can't fully rotate the screen. That's very annoying. I don't think anyone even mentioned that. I like the dial system much better compared to the Sony A7 Mark III, although there is that one dial that has a little button that you need to press before you rotate. I find that very annoying. Makes it less one-hand friendly for operation. The battery life is okay, it depends on the temperature and that kind of stuff. But battery is not something I'm gonna complain about, because ultimately, like, you just need to have quite a few batteries with you if you're a filmmaker. That's just how it is, that's the part of the job. If you're looking for a camera that can kind of do it all, you know, I have the FS7 that everyone talks about. I choose not to use it over this, because even though this is smaller, even though this is technically less fancy when you film with, this is the better camera. It's easier to use. If you're a single person, it's much easier to use, but it's also much better in many ways, depending on what you need, of course. You know, in this review, I didn't talk about everything, but I am a filmmaker in the documentary kind of world, and I do have a football magazine called Football is Everywhere and / production company. And the Sony A7SIII, I'm just gonna say it's the most perfect camera that can kind of do it all. And for now, that has been Michael Smolski, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.